In 1940, it seemed that Nazi Germany had found the formula to win a war that no one could stop. Within a few months, Poland had been defeated. Denmark and Norway fell, the Netherlands and Belgium were crushed. And then came the blow that shocked the world. France, one of Europe's greatest military powers, was defeated in just a few weeks. German tanks advanced at astonishing speed. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Entire armies were surrounded before they could even react. For many observers, the question was no longer whether Hitler would win the war, it was when. But there was a problem. Germany was about to face a coalition that possessed something far more powerful than an efficient army. It possessed time, resources, population, industry, and a production capacity that the German war machine simply could not overcome. And this is where the real story begins, because the Allies did not win the Second World War because of a single battle. It was not just D-Day. It was not just the Soviet Union. It was not just the entry of the United States. Victory was born from a gigantic transformation. The Allies managed to turn their entire economies into war machines, but before that happened, they had to survive. In 1940, the United Kingdom was practically alone in Western Europe. France had fallen, and Germany seemed ready to cross the English Channel. Then came the Battle of Britain. For months, German aircraft attacked British cities, air bases, and infrastructure. Hitler needed to destroy Britain's ability to resist before launching an invasion. But the British resisted, and that resistance had a much greater consequence than it seemed at the time. Germany had conquered enormous territories, but it could not turn those conquests into a definitive victory. The war continued, and while Hitler waited for a quick decision, the Allies began accumulating a silent advantage. Production. Modern warfare required fuel. Steel, trucks, aircraft, ships, ammunition. Radios and spare parts in absurd quantities. A destroyed tank had to be replaced. A downed aircraft had to be replaced. A broken truck needed parts, and an entire army had to be constantly supplied. This was a war that would not be won by brilliant generals alone. It would be won by whoever could produce and transport faster than the enemy could destroy. And then, in December 1941, something happened that would completely change the balance of the conflict. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States officially entered the war. And at that moment, a gigantic industrial power began mobilizing its economy toward a single objective. Germany still had experienced soldiers. It still had capable commanders. It still had formidable weapons. But now it faced something much harder to defeat, a war that was becoming too large for its ability to sustain it. And the most surprising thing is that this difference was only beginning to emerge, because while Hitler looked at the map in search of new conquests, his enemies were building something that could decide the entire war, an unprecedented war factory. And when this machine began operating at full scale, Germany would discover that winning battles was not enough to win a world war. But there was another factor that was even more brutal. Germany was about to open a front that would consume millions of men and forever change the fate of the conflict. The front that would take Hitler into the Soviet Union, and there, the war would begin to take a course that even the German generals could not control. In June 1941, Hitler made a decision that would change Germany's fate. Operation Barbarossa began. More than 3 million Axis soldiers advanced into the Soviet Union in one of the largest military invasions in history. The objective seemed simple: destroy the Red Army, conquer territory, capture resources, and force Moscow to sue for peace. At first, the plan seemed to work. German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Large cities and vast agricultural areas fell under German occupation. But there was something the Nazi planners could not control: distance. The farther the Germans advanced, The harder it became to supply their own armies, fuel had to travel enormous distances. Ammunition had to keep up with the tanks. Food had to reach the troops. Trucks broke down, railways had to be adapted, and every kilometer conquered increased the size of the problem. Then winter came, but blaming only the cold would be an oversimplification. The real enemy was a combination of Soviet resistance, distance, logistics, and time. The Soviet Union did not collapse. On the contrary, while the Germans advanced, Soviet factories were dismantled and transferred eastward beyond the reach of Nazi troops. Machines, workers, and equipment were sent to regions where they could continue producing weapons. The war was beginning to transform. Hitler had imagined a rapid campaign. He got a war of attrition, and a war of attrition increasingly favored Germany's enemies. But then another decisive element emerged: the United States. Even before directly entering the European conflict, the Americans were already increasing their industrial capacity and supplying equipment to the countries fighting the Axis. After Pearl Harbor, this mobilization exploded. American factories began producing aircraft, ships, trucks, tanks, ammunition, and equipment on a scale that was difficult to imagine. And here is one of the great keys to understanding the Allied victory. They did not just need to destroy the enemy. They needed to be able to replace their own losses. Imagine two armies. One loses 1,000 trucks and manages to receive 2,000 new ones. The other loses 1,000 and can replace only a few hundred. At first, the difference seems small. After months, it becomes decisive. After years, it can completely destroy a nation's combat capability. That was exactly the kind of pressure that began to hit Germany. And there was still another problem: oil. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ships needed fuel. Without oil, the powerful German military machine simply lost mobility. That is why the natural resources conquered. In Eastern Europe and the oil of the Caucasus were of enormous strategic importance. Hitler needed them. But every attempt to conquer new resources also required more troops, more fuel, and more supplies. It was a dangerous cycle. The more territory Germany tried to conquer, the larger the machine it had to feed became. Meanwhile, the Allies were doing exactly the opposite. They were connecting their economies, their sea routes, their industries, and their armies. And then came a battle that would definitively transform this war: Stalingrad. There, the German army would face not only Soviet soldiers, but a reality that Hitler had tried to ignore from the beginning. Germany could win spectacular battles, but it could not win a world war against enemies that possessed far greater resources. And after Stalingrad, the question ceased to be whether the Germans could conquer the Soviet Union. The question became, how long could Germany still resist? After Stalingrad, the war began to change direction. Germany still had powerful weapons, experienced soldiers, and capable commanders. But there was a fundamental difference. Now, on every front, the Germans had to spend resources that they could not replenish at the same speed, and the Allies were doing exactly the opposite. In the United States, industry had been transformed into a gigantic war factory. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines in impressive numbers. Ships were being built at an accelerated pace. Trucks and vehicles crossed the Atlantic. Ammunition was produced continuously, but producing weapons was not enough. They had to be delivered to the battlefield, and this was one of the greatest challenges of the Second World War. Imagine transporting millions of tons of equipment across oceans, infested with submarines. The Germans knew this. The Kriegsmarine tried to cut off the Allies' supply routes by using submarines to attack merchant ships. For some time, the threat was enormous, but the Allies began responding with convoys, escorts, radar, patrol aircraft, and intelligence. Little by little, the advantage shifted. The German submarines, which had previously terrorized the Atlantic, began to be hunted down, and when Germany lost the ability to interrupt the flow of supplies, a devastating consequence emerged. the Allies' industrial war could continue. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army was pushing the Germans back. Gigantic battles consumed men and equipment on an impressive scale. Germany needed to keep troops on the Eastern Front while facing air attacks, fighting in the Mediterranean, and later the threat of an invasion in the West was a situation impossible to sustain indefinitely. And then came the moment that entered history. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Thousands of Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and landed in Normandy, but the success of the operation depended not only on the courage of those men. Even before the landing, the Allies had carried out a gigantic deception campaign. They made the Germans believe that the main attack would take place elsewhere, near Calais. Fake tanks, radio transmissions, and carefully manipulated information helped keep part of the German forces away from Normandy. When Hitler realized what was happening, the invasion was already underway, and here was the true German nightmare. Germany now had to fight on two gigantic land fronts: in the east, against the Soviet Union; in the west, against the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and other Allied forces. And in the sky, the situation was even worse. Strategic bombing destroyed factories, railways, refineries, and transportation centers. Germany could still produce advanced weapons, but it often faced a simple problem. It could not get those weapons where they were needed. Tank sitting still for lack of fuel was not an effective weapon. An aircraft without fuel could not protect a city. An army without ammunition could not maintain an offensive. The war was revealing a brutal truth. Technological superiority alone was not enough. What mattered was the ability to turn resources into military power, transport that power, and keep it functioning for years. And the Allies had managed to do exactly that. But the final piece was still missing, because there was a question that remained unanswered. What, after all, was the factor that made German defeat practically inevitable? The answer was not in a single battle. It was in the combination of everything, and when these forces came together, Germany was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. In 1944, their soldiers Germany was still dangerous. Their tanks could still destroy Allied vehicles. Their aircraft and advanced weapons showed that the Nazi regime still possessed technological capabilities, but there was a fundamental difference. Germany was running out of options, and the Allies had more and more. In the east, the Red Army was advancing toward Berlin. In the west, American, British, Canadian, and other nations' forces were crossing Europe. In the south, the Allies had already opened another front through Italy. Germany was being squeezed. But the real reason for its defeat was not simply being surrounded. It was something much deeper. Germany lost the ability to sustain a long war against an industrially superior coalition. This is the part of the story that often remains hidden behind the great battles. When we think of World War II, we remember D-Day, Stalingrad, Pearl Harbor, or the fall of Berlin. But behind every battle was a gigantic structure: factories, oil ships, railways, trucks, food, ammunition, intelligence, men, and time. The Allies managed to bring these elements together on a scale that the Axis could not match. The United States provided extraordinary industrial capacity. The Soviet Union absorbed the initial impact of the invasion and then rebuilt its military power. The United Kingdom remained in the war when it seemed to be isolated. And together, the Allies managed to coordinate resources and open enough fronts to force Germany to divide its forces. Meanwhile, Hitler was making increasingly serious strategic mistakes. The invasion of the Soviet Union transformed a continental war into a gigantic war of attrition. The declaration of war on the United States brought against Germany an industrial power with far greater resources, and the insistence on holding impossible positions, even when withdrawal could save troops, further increased German losses. In the end, Germany was not defeated by a single secret weapon. It was defeated because its enemies managed to turn economic and industrial superiority into military power for long enough to crush it. And there is a powerful irony in this. At the beginning of the war, Germany seemed superior because it could concentrate force quickly. Its armies advanced like a blade, but a blade needs to remain sharp. And the longer the war became, the more the Allies were able to produce new blades, while Germany tried to keep the old ones functioning. In 1945, the outcome had already been decided. Berlin fell, Hitler died, and Nazi Germany surrendered, but the Allies' victory left a lesson that goes beyond. World War II, modern wars are not won only by those who have the best soldiers or the most advanced weapons. They are won by those who can keep an entire machine running when the conflict turns into a battle of endurance. Germany won impressive campaigns. The Allies won the war, and perhaps that is the most important difference of all, because Hitler managed to conquer enormous territories, but his enemies achieved something more difficult, keeping the war going until Germany had no more resources to continue. That was the real reason why the Allies won. World War II, it was not a single general. It was not a single battle. It was the combination of industry, resources, logistics, intelligence, resistance, and a coalition that managed to turn its enormous economic capacity into military strength. And when this machine finally reached its maximum speed, Germany no longer had any way to stop it. If you like stories that reveal what really happened behind the greatest conflicts in history, subscribe to the channel, because often the history that appears in books is only the beginning, and behind every great victory there is a much bigger story.